We are at Hebrews 12 and verse 18. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 18. We'll read from the text in just a moment. Just a little bit of a refresher, perhaps information for those that have not been in the class with us prior. The Hebrews writer, inspired of God, is writing to Christians of his day in the first century, which would have lived in the Palestine area, specifically near Jerusalem. And during that time, the temple in Jerusalem, where under the law of Moses, they would go and worship. They would go and take their animal sacrifices there under the law of Moses. That temple was still standing. And some of their very own Jewish family members and friends were still holding on to the law of Moses and continuing to follow it and continuing to take their sacrifices there and to follow that law, although Jesus had already come and fulfilled the law of Moses. Matthew 5 and verse 17, we could read Ephesians chapter 2 and verses 14 and 15, Colossians 2 and verse 14. Jesus took the law of Moses out of the way. He nailed it to the cross. He fulfilled its purpose, and ultimately it was pointing to him, Galatians chapter 3, so that we might have salvation. The law of Moses could not save. While certainly those under the law of Moses could be saved, it was all because of Jesus. And the Hebrews writer even notes that in his writing. Well, here you have Jewish Christians who are undergoing persecution. They're undergoing rejection. They are, some of them perhaps, losing their livelihoods, losing their lives because they are Christians, because they are followers of Christ, which was at this time still a relatively new movement in the eyes of the world. And some of them were doubting whether it was worth it. Some of them had already given up on following Jesus, gathering with the church, maybe going back to following the law of Moses. And the Hebrews writer writes to them with many words that we've considered already, and shows without a doubt that Jesus is better than anything that the law of Moses has to offer. The new covenant is better than anything that the old covenant has to offer. And the old covenant served its purpose, and it certainly has pictures within it that are fulfilled in the new covenant. And so he is urging them with many ways and many different examples that were important to them to stay faithful to Jesus. That if you leave him, if you leave Christ, there is no way to be saved. You can't go back to the law of Moses and think that you can be saved under that law any longer, because that law is no longer in effect. It no longer had authority. And so in Hebrews chapter 12, at the beginning of this chapter, the Hebrews writer summarizes or points back to the many examples he's mentioned in what we read in chapter 11 and what we call the Hall of Fame of Faith, where all of these individuals like Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and so many others, we can look at their faith. We can go back and see their examples of faith, and he points to them as examples. And then in chapter 12 says, we are surrounded by these witnesses, these whose their lives are testimonies of as individuals that lived for God, faced the unknown, even because they wanted to follow what God said. And it all goes back to God spoke and they obeyed him. They did what God told them to do. That's what faith is. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Romans 10 in verse 17. In this chapter, we've seen time and again from verse 1 all the way to verse 17, imagery related to sports and athletics, especially track and field, like running, marathon running, and then you have also perhaps even boxing or hand-to-hand combat that is being, or competition that is being mentioned here, as he would say that you've not resisted unto blood, verse 4, striving against sin. You've not finished your fight yet. In verse 13, or excuse me, verse 12, lift up the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, lest that which is lame be turned out of the way, but let it rather be healed. So time and again, he is urging them, keep pushing forward, keep persevering. That is the most difficult part of the Christian life, is it not? We could argue over what's the most difficult part, I suppose, or disagree even on that, but certainly keeping on can be difficult. And so the same lessons come down even to us today, to continue being faithful, keep moving forward. As he brings this to a close, as he is bringing this even to the pinnacle of his writing, and then he will close out with some practical exhortations in chapter 13. He's really going to pack it full of things that they were very familiar with because they were Jews, because they knew of the Old Testament scriptures, because they followed the Old Testament scriptures for so long. They knew of these events. So when we come to verse 18, he's going to reference some of those occasions, and we're going to go back and rewind and look at them a little bit for ourselves tonight. We're going to read 18 through 21, and then we'll come back and note the occasion that is being spoken of here. He says, "For ye are not come unto the mount that might be touched, and that burned with fire, nor unto blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet, and the voice of words, which voice they that heard entreated that the word should not be spoken to them any more. For they could not endure that which was commanded. And if so much as a beast touch the mountain, it shall be stoned or thrust through with a dart. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake." The Hebrews writer reminds them of an occasion in their history, the history of their forefathers. And that was such an occasion when they had come out of Egyptian bondage. And he has already reminded them of that escape from Egyptian bondage. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 19 for a moment. Moses was entrusted by God and charged by God to lead his people out of Egypt. They went across dry ground where the Red Sea was. God had parted the waters for them. Before that, they had seen the many wonders that God had caused to happen in the form of plagues against the gods of the Egyptians, to show that he is the one true God, that he is the God of heaven, that he is truly all-powerful, and these idolatrous gods are nothing. And not only was it a message for the Egyptians, but it was a message for the Hebrews, those he was bringing out, the Israelites that he was bringing out of Egypt. And we come to chapter 19. It's the third month since they have left Egypt. When the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. So there in the wilderness of Sinai, there was a mountain. Perhaps you have heard of Mount Sinai, as he would make mention of even in the Hebrews writer makes mention of in Hebrews chapter 12. On this occasion, we learn that Moses would go up into the mountain and God would speak with him there. God would give him words, and then Moses was to take those words and give them to the people, the Israelites, and that's precisely what he did. Moses was the only one who was allowed to go up. The others were not allowed to go up. If you come down a little further here in chapter 19, he gives them a message. The people agree. He tells them to obey, to keep my covenant, and they say that they will do that. They answered together, verse 8, that they would do so. Then verse 9, the Lord said unto Moses, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever. And Moses told the words of the people unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go unto the people, and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and be ready against the third day, for the third day the Lord will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai. So he's going to give them things that they are to do to prepare themselves for this reverential occasion, this truly fearful occasion. As you continue in verse 12, thou shalt set bounds unto the people round about the mountain, saying, Take heed to yourselves, that you go not up unto the mount, or touch the border of it. Whosoever toucheth the mount shall be surely put to death. There shall not an hand touch it, but he shall surely be stoned, or shot through. Whether it be beast or man, it shall not live. When the trumpet soundeth long, they shall come up to the mount. Moses went down from the mount unto the people, and sanctified the people, and they washed their clothes, and so he got them ready for that third day. And when that third day came to pass, we're going to see some things that take place here. It came to pass on the third day, verse 16, in the morning, that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. And the Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke. It was up in smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in a fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mount. And the Lord called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up. I cannot begin to comprehend what this was like. You know, this time of year, people with, not because of Brother Billy's birthday or the election, but maybe Halloween, people are a little more afraid. People like to engage in watching scary movies, perhaps, or other types of things. I recall, I don't watch scary movies too much. I'm not really interested in them. I do recall as a teenager going with some friends and we saw the movie The Ring in the theater. And, you know, it has an effect on you. And we come out, and there my vehicle had a flat tire right after watching the movie. Something was going on, right? No, but those movies have an effect on us. But what is it about a movie like that, or something like that, that would really make it the most frightening? And I would think it would be if it was something that could actually happen. You know, if we understand that much of these things are made up, but if it's something that can actually happen, then that might make it even more frightening. If someone could put this event into a film, I don't even know that we could grasp and truly what they experienced on that day, that they were scared to death. So much so that when Moses would come and talk to them, a little later on, you'll read that they say, we've had enough. They were scared to death. And even the Hebrews writer says that Moses was afraid. They're seeing thunderings and lightnings. This is not just a storm that's passing by. This is something that God is showing, that He is the Creator, that He is the God of above, that He is the God that they need to heed, and the one who has brought them out of Egypt, that they need to listen to Him. And He's impressing upon them the seriousness of following His law and the severity of sin. And so they had great fear on this occasion. Coming down a little more, chapter 20 and verse 18. In chapter 20, you can read through what's oftentimes what is called the Ten Commandments, and where Moses is going to give some of those first principles that they were to follow. under the law that was given to him. And then after he's given these laws, verse 18, all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. And Moses said unto the people, Fear not, for God is come to prove you, and that his fear may be before your faces, that you sin not. And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where God was. So we'll go back to Hebrews 12 now. And the Hebrews writer reminds them of this fearful occasion where God was showing his presence, showing his power, giving them his principles, and telling them, don't sin. But he says to them, he says, you're not in that group anymore. You're not come to that physical mountain where you have to be afraid that if you touch it, you would die. You're not seeing this physical darkness and the mountain that burned with fire, or the darkness or the tempest or the sound of the trumpet that was taking place, or the voice that was coming out of the clouds. You're not there. Why do you want to go back to that? And he is suggesting to them, for they could not endure that which was commanded, verse 20, and if so, as a beast touched the mountain, it shall be stoned or thrust through with a dart. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I exceedingly fear and quake. He says, but you are come unto Mount Zion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaketh better things than that of Abel. See that you refuse not him that speaketh, for if they escape not who refused him that spake on earth, much more shall not we escape if we turn away from him that speaketh from heaven. He says you're not at that physical mountain anymore. You're not receiving the law which was given by Moses. You're not experiencing those same things. That happened for a reason. That was given for the purpose that God had intended. But now you have come to a far greater mountain, Mount Zion. What is Mount Zion? The first occasion that we read this word is actually 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 7. I'm not certain who it was that originated the term, who gave the name to this city, but it was another name for Jerusalem. Very likely and very possible that God gave it that name. We oftentimes sing about Zion in our songs, but in 2 Samuel 5 and verse 7, we read where nevertheless David took the stronghold of Zion, the same as the city of David. The city of David there being Jerusalem, I believe that we're referring to. Zion, if you think about it in the terms that were given for Jerusalem, Zion could not hide. It was on a hill. Jerusalem was on a hill. We think about the scriptures like when Jesus says that a city is set on a hill that cannot be hid. And he would make application to Christians with that very thought. Zion also was fortified. Jerusalem was a fortified city, especially under the rule of David. In 2 Samuel 5 and verse 9, David dwelt in the fort and called it the city of David, and David built around about from Millo and inward. But Zion also was glorified. It was oftentimes exalted in the minds of the Jews. And we can even find it being mentioned in prophecy. It was prophesied. So Zion could not hide. It was fortified. It was glorified. It was prophesied. In Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, Isaiah says, "It shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it, and many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." When we fast forward then to the New Testament, in the days of Jesus upon the earth, he told his apostles that they would first essentially carry the gospel. The church would begin in Jerusalem, and then it would go to the uttermost parts of the earth. The gospel would begin to be preached in Jerusalem, and then it would be taken to the uttermost parts of the earth. Never was it God's intention for it to stay only in Jerusalem. Neither was it only for the people of Jerusalem. But it was this message and this truth and this institution of the church that would be the body where all men could be saved, not just Jew, but Jew and Gentile, that all could be saved. And that's the Zion that the Hebrews writer is speaking of here. While the physical Jerusalem might have been in the minds of these Hebrew Christians, when he first mentions it, he's pointing them clearly to a spiritual reference, because he goes on to say, "You've come unto Mount Zion, unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven." These Jewish Christians were certainly very much tied to physical things. The law of Moses certainly had many more physical aspects to it than what we are called, what is involved in our lives. Think about this for a moment. When they were come out of Egypt, the place that they were given and they were instructed to build that would be their place of worship was what? It was the tabernacle. It was a tent, but a very large one, and a very extravagant one, a very beautiful one with fine materials, but it was something that they could carry and they could transport from place to place, and they could set it up and they could worship God there. They could bring their sacrifices to the priest there, and the priest would offer them on behalf offer them to God. And eventually, though, in the days of David, what did he want to do? He wanted to build a more fortified, a more permanent place for that locale. Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure if that was ever God's intent or not, but you have this progression from a tent, which in our minds is more temporary, to something that is more permanent, that has much finer materials, much stronger materials, much more valuable materials that makes up the temple. And you come to the days of Jesus, and even his disciples then had this grand view of this beautiful temple, and they boasted of its beauty, and Jesus informed them it was not always going to be there, and that even in their lifetime, that within that generation, that it would be destroyed. But God progressed that further, if you will, made it a temple that is not made with hands, a spiritual temple, a spiritual place to worship. Mount Zion, heavenly Jerusalem, the church of the firstborn. The church is not a physical place. We are, as members of the body of the church, make up the church, It is a spiritual kingdom of which we are a part here. And yet, there is still another level of progression, is there not? Where what are we at the final permanent place that we want to be with the church here? Or are we longing for heaven? The church is destined for heaven. And so you see this when you look through the history of God's revelation to mankind and the carrying out of God's will. You see this progression and how that things are constantly getting better in from our perspective, and that God wants us to have the best in the end that He provides. And so the Hebrews writer is saying, why would you want to go back to that which is more inferior? I had a little fun today thinking about a computer technology and even our storage abilities. I forgot to bring the calculations I made up, but some of them I may remember off of in my mind. But I remember, growing up in the late 1900s, in the 90s, we had these 3.5-inch floppy disk, and I remember the 5.25 floppy disk, and thinking about the storage capacity. They could hold about 1.44 megabytes, which is not even one of the pictures on my phone. I think my phone, and my phone's at least 4 years outdated. I don't even think it'd hold one of those. It'd hold about 4 of our bulletins, I think. That's the way I calculated it. And then when I entered college at the University of Georgia, I've still got my first thumb drive that I got. And we located it not too long, a few years ago, and I was like, I think it's 128 gigabyte. No, it was 128 megabytes, which is a good bit more than the floppy disk. But then you progress on and you come to this, and this is, again, outdated and a lower model even when I got it. 4 years. It's still good, though. And it's a 64 gigabytes. You can get, my understanding, you can get at least a terabyte now in an iPhone, and they're talking about a 2 terabyte very soon in an iPhone. And I thought about, how many of those floppy disks would it take to make up a terabyte? And in the fun I had, you would have to have nearly 30,000 pounds of floppy disk to equate to that. Did the dimensions of my office, and it would fill up halfway up the office. Not quite over my head, despite what you might think, Jim, but it was over 4 feet, or about 4 feet. It would fill up my office for 1 terabyte of information. Now, while I'm an old soul, and there's certainly traditional things and nostalgia that I enjoy, and when it comes to computer technology, I don't think that I want to go back to that inferior floppy disk. It has advanced greatly, far greater than anything that we have to offer upon this earth. Obviously, is the spiritual kingdom that God has built, His church, and the Hebrews writer is trying to continue to place into their minds, the Jewish Christians, that reality, that what you have now is the best that you can have here upon the earth. It is the best. If you go back, you have nothing, because you have left your Savior. You have left the one who provides you with salvation. He says, you are not come unto that mountain where there was fear and trembling, but you are come unto the mountain where there is grace and mercy. You've come unto the mountain where you can be saved and ultimately have a home in heaven. What questions or comments about this so far? We're not going to we're going to stop essentially there at Mount Zion and dig a little further into some of these other descriptions of the church in the near future. What questions or comments? going back to the thought of Zion, I mentioned that Zion could not hide. Zion was fortified, it was glorified, it was prophesied, it was the city where God abides. And when we take that thought and realize that the Hebrews writer is calling the church Mount Zion, well, the church cannot hide. Matthew 5:14 through 16. There, Jesus says, a city that is set on the hill cannot be hid. He says to his disciples, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. And he comes down in Matthew 5 and verse 16 and says, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. The church cannot hide. The church is fortified. It's fortified by the word of God, the armor of God, Ephesians 6:10 through 18. The church is glorified by God in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. There, God reveals to us through the Apostle Paul that God has essentially, the church is like a display even to those in the heavens, the angels and principalities. He is saying, look at my manifold wisdom in what I have created in building the church. It is displayed there to us in Ephesians 3, 7 through 11. Certainly the church was prophesied, Isaiah 2, 2 and 3, as we read a few moments ago. And the church is where God abides. We read here in Hebrews 12, 22 through 24. That ye are come unto Mount Zion, unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaketh better things than that of Abel. What questions or comments do you have? All right, well, that'll be it for tonight's class. Lord willing, we will move forward in our text here at verse 22 next week.